how do we get more venture capital funding to northern Nigeria? Taking a macro view of VC funding in Africa in 2022, according to The Big Deal, Africa the Big Deal, $4.84 billion in venture capital funding was raised by Africa startups in 2022, increase of 7.62% year on year. So that's impressive. Now, as far as the top 4 African nations to raise this VC funding, it's the usual suspects. Nigeria, 1.2 billion. South Africa, 1.1 billion. Kenya, 820 million. Egypt, 550 million. Now, focusing more on Nigeria, the southern region of the nation is absolutely dominating funding for tech startups. And where else? Lagos, where we are. According to a report from Disrupt Africa, Lagos houses 84% of all startups in Nigeria. So just take 84% of all the VC funding that came into Africa, and you can allocate 84% of all the VC funding that came into Nigeria, and that's going to Lagos. So what about northern Nigeria, which has to compete with other regions for the remaining 16%? All right, we're going to be talking to the founding partner of TTLabs, Surayyah Ahmad. She's joining us from London right now. They assist early stage founders, and they've been having a particular focus on northern Nigeria. Surayyah, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. You wrote a very enlightening article about the funding issues facing startups in northern Nigeria. Lack of investor awareness, lack of infrastructure. Good morning. Good morning. Thanks for joining us. Can you address how each of these can be fixed, starting with a lack of awareness?
Thank you very much for having me, Reuters. And I think you have to give it to Lagos because they've actually done a lot of work to get to where they are currently. So one of the things that really sort of gives a startup that initial milestone or initial step is having investment from family and friends. Is one of the first forms of investment that a startup needs to access. However, when you come to northern Nigeria, you discover that a lot of high net worth individuals or people that could actually support founders at the early stage do not really understand tech investing or angel investing in that particular context. So they're not usually willing to write a small check between maybe 2 to 5 million naira for startup founders. So that means these founders that are even struggling to, feed themselves or get jobs and all of that, do not even have that initial, boost that will allow them to build their products. Talk less of going to get international VC funding.
Now, you mentioned in your article that you wrote, I think it was in Medium, that many startups require, of course, early stage angel capital from their family and friends. Surayyah, are you struck by how little mention there is of banks and loans when you have conversations around startup funding?
So to be honest, when you look at bank loans, they're just not suitable for startups. Because startups are high growth and potentially high risk businesses. Of course, the higher the risk, the higher the return. So you're looking at funding that's given to people to try out things, to take risk, and bank loans aren't for taking risk. And if you also look at the current interest rate, which is about 18 to 22%, even for small medium enterprises, that's very high interest rate to pay on loans, unless they have really high margins. So bank loans are definitely not suitable for startups.
So as far as VCs are concerned, in terms of the risk, they're able to take that risk. It's part of the game. They accept that. Is that right?
Yeah. So with VC, there is a general acceptance that is only 1 or 2 companies out of 10 that are going to succeed. But the fact is, those 1 or 2 companies, because of that very high growth potential, they're usually able to compensate for the other 8 that did not succeed or failed. I think averagely the return on VC investment is about 700% over a fund period, or about 56% per annum, and that's very high return. But obviously, it also comes with the risk of losing more than half of the companies that you've invested in.
Now, we've talked about, infrastructure was part of what you mentioned in your article about the challenges facing VC funding for startups in northern Nigeria. Broadband internet. I want to ask you about broadband internet penetration. 48.2% so far, but I'm going to guess that much of that is in the southern region and maybe not much up north. But is this the single most important infrastructure for startups in the region as far as broadband internet penetration is concerned?
Honestly, I don't think that's the most important problem. And I also think there is sort of a spread in that 48.2% because there is a lot of internet penetration in the north as well. But when you have internet and you have no power, so how then is somebody supposed to use internet without something to actually power their devices? So we have a major issue when it comes to power. Then we also have an ecosystem issue. So when we don't have enough hubs or co-working spaces where people can actually come together and use maybe desktop or laptops to write code and stuff. I have many people getting in touch to say, I'm struggling to get a laptop and I want to be a coder. So you can see how, we can't just say broadband as a single problem is what is, hindering the north. It is one of the problems, but there are other infrastructural issues that need to be handled.
You just made me, laptops are imported, so the exchange rate is going to also factor in there. What a laptop costs today versus what it cost a year or two ago, with where the dollar to naira exchange rate now, that's also a big hurdle. But what solutions can you give us? Can you talk us through solutions to bridging the funding gap for startups in northern Nigeria?
So I think number one, the region has to wake up itself, right? So you're not going to expect somebody to come from outside northern Nigeria to solve northern Nigeria's problem. We need to look within, and I think that's what we're doing collectively with the Northern Founders Community, TTLabs, and trying to galvanize that ecosystem, right? So that the approach is strategic and it is holistic. So yeah, that's one way of solving the problem. Another way is establishing regional VCs. So currently, you can't point at a VC that's, strictly coming from northern Nigeria or strictly trying to address that angel investment gap. But at TTLabs, we have an early stage fund coming up that's basically going to invest in, startups that have Pan-African or global potential from northern Nigeria. And obviously this cuts across the north central, the northeast, and the northwest, and give them small tickets that would help them, take that first step towards building investable products.
Great stuff.
So obviously we talked about co-working spaces and funding existing hubs. And also there needs to be some leveling up from the government, right? What usually happens is when you have a region that's really sort of low in terms of skills and infrastructure and all of those issues that we've mentioned, usually you need to do like a special fund that is focused on leveling up that region with other regions so that there is some competition going on.
Thank you so much for the breakdown. You mentioned government. What do you make of the Nigerian Startup Act that was, that's been signed into law?
I think it's a good first step, right? I'm actually part of the implementation committee, but what I find a little bit disturbing when it comes to the Nigerian Startup Act, especially in relation to the North, is the fact that our issues are peculiar to us, right? So the Nigerian Startup Act, for example, is going to label startups, then label startups would have access to early stage funding. Amazing. But that process of labeling is naturally going to leave out companies that were not even able to access angel stage funding. So that means if they couldn't access angel stage funding, they couldn't build the startups, then they cannot be labeled, and then that means they cannot access early stage funding. So it means that the intervention, it needs to come at a much earlier stage than what the Nigerian Startup Act is offering. And obviously it needs to be work from the private sector, the government, as well as collaboration with the Lagos ecosystem to help us level up.
Great stuff. Thank you. And it's great to know that you were part of that Startup Act as well. Good to see the government engaging private sector players like yourself for the Startup Act. Can you walk us through the TTLabs launch strategy for startups? We've got the list. How does your launch strategy work out?
So currently what we do is a 6 months program. In the first 3 months, we have a couple of startups in the cohort. We put them through an idea validation process, which includes looking at their ideas, working with industry experts to help them validate their idea, and then, building some form of prototype that would allow them to test the market. Now, startups that have done exceptionally well within the first 3 months will then be taken to the next 3 months of the program, where they're going to have funding of up to $10,000. And these startups will then use that funding to gain initial traction, and will then pass them into our pipeline of local and international investors. Most of these investors probably from Lagos, or people that we work with already. And then, it goes all the way to international investors that have the potential to invest at pre-seed stage.
All right, great stuff. Now, look, I want to ask you, regionally, Nigeria topping funding for VC inflows into Africa. Do you see Nigeria maintaining that pole position in the near future compared to your Kenya, South Africa, Egypt, and so on?
I think Nigeria, we're hustlers, right? And we're very dogged in our approach. And especially with the rest of the regions now trying to catch up, I see Nigeria even going further than where we are currently. It is definitely collaborative work. For example, there are startups in Lagos that want to penetrate the northern market, but that was really difficult for them. And now we're opening things up. We're launching a knowledge exchange partnership program that would allow startups in Lagos trying to get into the north to actually get talent from the north that would help them access that market. So with that sort of cross-country collaboration, we're looking at our startups doing better, hopefully gaining more traction, and keeping that first place that we have in terms of being the forefront of VC funding in Africa.
Great stuff. I have to pick your brain on artificial intelligence. I have to tell you, I was using Microsoft Bing earlier this morning for part of our research for the show, and this thing starts talking to me as I'm putting in search queries that I would normally read. How do you think AI will impact startups in Africa? Or, Surayyah, is that a bridge too far at this point? Should we just be focusing on funding? What's your thoughts on AI?
I think just like a lot of other things in terms of technological innovations, Africa has been sort of the last, or the consumer, in terms of when tech has already been innovated. I think that's also what we're going to see in AI, right? Developing AI technology requires, infrastructure, fast internet, power, high processing power, and all of those things that a lot of African countries do not have. But in terms of utilizing AI, I think we will see a lot of AI utilization in fintech. We're having a brain drain currently where people are leaving, Nigeria and other African countries to work in developed countries. So AI can help us write, low code applications in terms of fraud detection, as well as credit ratings. So I think AI will be useful in that sense. Then we also have, a lot of use or utilization in agricultural sector. So detecting crop diseases, soil analysis, and all of that. So that's really going to come in handy in terms of AI utilization. However, where we are developing sort of strictly AI applications or AI infrastructure companies, I think, that's a bridge too far. But yeah.
Well, we might get there one day. Listen, great conversation with you, Surayyah Ahmad, founding partner at TTLabs. You're doing great work focusing on startups in northern Nigeria. We wish you the best of luck, and we got to have you back on the show to talk about developments in the tech sector. So thank you so much for joining us from London. We appreciate your time.